Okay, good morning. Okay. Next week is going to be our last class until after Yantif. And as I think I mentioned beforehand, that next week's class is going to be the annual review of material that we learned over the course of the past year that is relevant for sharing at your Seder. Right? This way, your families will see where you've been disappearing every week, and that will allow you to continue coming once they are bowled away by the material that you will be sharing with them, and that you actually have an opportunity to look back and see what we've accomplished over the course of the last year. So that's going to be next week. The next Thursday, which is the Thursday before Pesach, and is already the auspicious date of the 10th of Nisan, which is the day of the taking of the Korban Pesach in Egypt, and a moment where we are all flying with an intense frenzy to get ourselves ready for Pesach in 5 days. There will be no class. Again, if you want material to do during that hour, I have to provide you. There's a whole list of old videos about Pesach that you'll put on while you're during that 9:30 slot, either that day or Chol Hamoed, and we will resume Yirtzeh Hashem the week after Pesach. Okay, so just I want to start. We need to clean up. And again, just before we start, I wanted to dedicate our learning this morning Le'ilui Nishmas Yehuda Leibush Ben Shraga Feivel, in memory of Dr. Lion Mandelkorn, who again has been a pillar of the shul community for many, many years, and a very we have an expression in the Gemara Chavald al Avdin V'lo Mishtachvin, kind of woe for those who are lost and cannot be found or replaced. In other words, there's certain kinds. I mean, everybody is obviously unique, just by dint of being a human being. But there are certain kinds of people who play certain kinds of pivotal roles, and that are quite literally in their families and their communities irreplaceable. So Dr. Mandelkorn is certainly one of those people. It was a tremendous chus to have had the opportunity to get to know him, and develop a bond with him over the years that I was here. It's a special chus that I was able to give a hesped at his funeral this week. And so again, I think just our learning should be, I'm sure there are many people here who were students of his, whether formally or informally. So I think it's certainly appropriate that we should, in his shul, to be able to perpetuate his memory and his schus. Okay. I want to come back. We had talked. We're the last psukim of Parashat Shalach, chapter 17. Really, the last three psukim, starting with 14. And we had been talking a little bit about the role of Yehoshua, right? And there's why specifically Moshe is told to tell Yehoshua about the idea that there's going to be a perpetual war between God and Amalek. Right, whatever exactly that means, whether that's about Yehoshua's concern that he doesn't actually finish the job that he began, right? That he, even though he goes to war, right? And the psukim are very inconclusive, right? About what was the end of that war. In other words, was there victory? How do you even define victory in a war? And I think that led us to some kind of a tangent, but we got back on track. The idea that perhaps that Yehoshua, either as the person who's bringing the Jews into Eretz Yisrael, and that touched off, we had a whole conversation about when this last section takes place. In other words, is this the immediate aftermath of the battle, right? Or is this an editorial insertion at the end of 40 years in the Midbar, right? That we have this follow-up, the same way, by the way, that we had that same conversation about the end of the story of the Mun, right? Where the end of the story of the Mun, there is a clearly anachronistic addition, if you're just going to read frontally, of putting a jar of Mun, right, in front of or inside the Aron, right? There was no Aron, right? So it can't be that those psukim take place at that time. So it's not an unusual thing that we would find such a thing. There's kind of a follow-up embedded into the story before the Chasimas HaTorah, before the Torah was sealed at the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life. One last thing I wanted to say about, and in general, we talked about the idea that perhaps this is part of the responsibility of the Melech, right? And there's anyone who is the national leader of the Jewish people, right, inherited this mitzvah Mechias Amalek, right? So Yeshua is the first paradigm of that. But really, it's not just Yeshua qua Yehoshua, right? It's Yeshua and in that role of the proto-Melech, right? He's the first person to assume that role. And again, in the same way that Shaul and later David, right, and there's kind of inherit that responsibility, it's given over to Yehoshua as well. Okay. We talked about whether the reference to putting it in a book, right, is a reference to the Torah specifically. In other words, the idea that later, right, and we're going to have those psukim of Parsha Zachar, right, that we find in the book of Devarim, right, and that's what's being referenced here, right? Alternatively, other Mepharshim want to say that it's not that, it's a lost book, right? It's a book that we no longer have access to today, which again is not surprising. There are references in Chumash and certainly in Navi, right, to any number of books that we just don't have. Right, the books were not saved, they were not preserved, which is not surprising. That the vast majority of the Library of Antiquity doesn't make it to modern times. Right, it doesn't survive. Right, there are many books both within the world of Torah and Lahavdil in the world of general literature, right, that we know about their existence because of references in other places, right, but we don't know for sure what was in those books, right? And again, it's always a possibility, right? One day somebody will dig up in, a cave or in somebody's attic or something, right, a copy of these lost books. We just don't know. And that's kind of where we're at. Okay. Any last questions, right, on this, last section about Amalek? Okay, good. We spent, I feel like we yes. Okay, fine, good. All right, so let's deal with the last, somewhat enigmatic pasuk. Smadar, if you want to read pasuk Zion, verse 16.
ויאמר כי יד על קץ השם מלחמה השם בעמלק מדור. And he said, for the hand is the throne of God, a war gods with Amalek from generation to generation.
Okay. Good. So what does this mean?
It means that in every generation there will be an Amalek who goes after the Jews, the Israelis, the weak and the elderly, people who are not expecting it. And I think we know. I think we see it.
Okay, it's a beautiful speech. Where do you see this in the words?
Ledor, wherever.
Okay, so before we get to that, right, we have to kind of understand this contextually of what is the pasuk saying. So we have this interesting so what does it mean, a hand on the throne of God?
Some kind of oath.
Okay, it seems like it's some kind of oath, right? The idea of, we have a concept of that when we think in human terms of taking a vow, right? The idea that, and this is something that exists in halacha and lahavdil, you have in various legal systems, kind of an offshoot of this, the idea of taking a object that has some kind of sanctity, right, and touching it, right, or invoking it, right, as a way of buttressing the truth, right, the veracity, right, or the seriousness of commitment, right, of what you are doing, right? And there's sometimes we do this by using names of God, right? That's very much part of, interestingly enough, the ambiguity, the ambivalence that we have in Jewish tradition about taking oaths, right? Because the idea is that an oath is explicitly or implicitly invoking the name of God, right? It's very strong medicine, right? So here, God is swearing on his throne, right? His throne is some kind of a
How do you know it's God that's swearing?
So I think again, so it's so I think the implication, right, the speaker here, right, of Vayomer, right? So Rashi says that this is that Moshe is the speaker, right? But what he seems to be communicating, right, he's making a commitment for God, right? And he's saying Milchama Hashem ba'Amalek, and this goes back to the idea that we talked about this a little bit last time, right? That in this section we are focusing more on the idea of God's promise, right? God's, let's call it, covenant about making a reckoning with Amalek, right? And there's, as opposed to what we find in Devarim, which is about the human role, right? The human responsibility in the midst of Mechias Amalek, right? So it seems, right, like from what's being said here, it sounds like this is maybe like a prophecy or that Moshe is relaying some kind of divine commitment. Okay. So Rashi here notes, and this is really based on a medrash, that his starting point is that the word case, right, the word that's used for throne here, is a very strange word, right? That it is some kind of shortened form of the word kisei, right, which is the normal word for chair or for throne, right? And he says not only is the word kisei, right, abbreviated, but even the form of God's name that's being used here, Yud and Hey, right, is itself an abbreviated form of Shem Havaya. And I think we take a step back here. In other words, the whole effect of this phrase, if one looks carefully, this is a sequence of 5 two-letter words, right? And there's something almost staccato, right, about the effect of the way that these words are set up. So Rashi here quotes the Medrash and says, "Nishba Kadosh Baruch Hu she'ein shemo shalem ve'ein kiso shalem ad sheyimcha shemo shel Amalek kulo." Right, that God here is making a commitment, right, that his throne is not complete, nor is his name complete, right, as long as Amalek exists, right? So we have to kind of drill down for a second to understand, right, what the implication of that idea is. His name is not complete. His throne is not complete as long as Amalek exists. So what do you make of that? Shashank.
I was just thinking, I heard somebody recently said that Amalek is like philosophy is more kind of like has less to do with Hashem being Amalek or a king, like so its name. It's not complete, or his throne is not complete, it's not complete until that says this kind of one.
Okay, so the idea that whatever it is, I'm just trying to, whatever it is Amalek represents, right? And again, one possibility is to say that Amalek here perhaps represents the idea of chance, right? And there's the idea of not seeing a divine providence, right? And again, that whole idea to some degree has to do with the fact that as the Psukim present it, right, that Amalek attacks when the Jewish people say, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin, right? Is God in our midst or not, right? That to some degree is kind of presents, let's call it the spiritual opening, right, for the attack of Amalek. All right, but I want to take a step back. Right, whatever it is, let's leave Amalek for the moment as a black box. Right, we don't know exactly what Amalek represents per se. There are a lot of different possibilities. Right, but whatever it is that we are supposed to war against, right, that God's. So you want to say that this is a question of sovereignty, right? And there's the idea that, and that seems to focus specifically on the shortened form of the word throne. Yeah. Okay. So what does that mean? As long as there's like the God's sovereignty is deficient, just speak it out a little bit.
I don't know whether this makes sense. I was thinking. So I apologize. So in the Torah, the other kind of description of the hand under the thigh, and so I'm curious whether the throne might be a euphemism of something, and if so, like what is it about this, like seed productivity that's some, and I don't know that a limitation, like what does it mean to have a limitation on this?
What's the one? Sorry.
A limitation on, like it obviously comes from us. But,
good, right? And it's the question of perception, right? And it's the question of how we perceive. Okay, Elaine, did you have something on this specific question?
This would be oversimplification, but that Amalek would embody all of evil.
Okay.
So that, sort of the reference to Mashiach. You know what I mean? That you can't have nothing complete. We wouldn't be able to see any completion.
Okay. Right. So in other words, again, as long as there is Amalek, right, whatever exactly Amalek is, right, as that Amalek the nation, Amalek the concept, Amalek the stand-in for, whatever, right, that we cannot perceive, right, our ability, right, to be able to perceive God in the world, right, is blunted. Right, is that we're not able to see it, right? So the idea of the throne, right? And the throne is a metaphor for God's might and majesty in the world, right? You see a king on his throne, you know exactly who he is, right? He's the king, right? He is in his proper place, right? And that this kind of touches perhaps on kind of a basic problem that we have in terms of dealing with God, right? The Navi says, Hashem says, Hashamayim kisi v'haaretz hadom ragli, right? That the heavens are my throne, right? And the earth is my footstool, right? So the throne, right? Obviously, the footstool is like a secondary kind of it's like the ottoman, right? It's the secondary piece of God's enthronement, and that's something, right? That the nature of this world, right, is that we don't see God, and can't see God, right, in His entirety. And there's the idea that we only see kind of refracted pieces of godliness in this world, right? And the idea that Amalek represents, right, all of those things that keep us from seeing God, or to kind of to take it much more metaphorically, right? That if, and we'll use Elaine's formulation here, if Amalek, whatever exactly Amalek is, but if Amalek equals evil, right? Evil, right? And there's the idea that we live in a world, right, where there is justice and bad things, right? Those are the places where it's challenging for us to perceive God being present, right? And there's, again, you really have to be of deep faith, right, to be able to perceive God in the darkness, right? So and even this idea, right, of that Ein Hashem Shalom, right? God's name is not complete, right? A name is the way that you identify somebody, right? As you know somebody, right, by their name, right? But his name, right, is hidden, right? And this again really touches on kind of Kabbalistic concepts, right? Some of you might be familiar. A lot of people do this. They think it's Seder, just because it's printed on Haggadahs, right? That we make this statement before various parts of the Seder. Or Liyached Shem Yudke B'Vavke, right? That we are trying to unite, right, the names Yud-Hey and Vav-Hey, right, which is very much related to this idea. What does it mean to unite the names Yud-Hey and Vav-Hey? Right, so the idea that we have there's a
because you don't want to give up USA. Yeah.
our theoretical conception of God, right, and God as He is present in our world. Like they don't really line up completely. Right? We don't see how God is, what kind of like feeling perceive God in the world, right? And there's also God as He is, right, enthroned in the beyond, right? And we don't often see how these things naturally kind of hook up, right? And the idea that whatever this Mitzvah Amalek represents, right, is the idea that this is about the mystery of living in a world where God is not directly manifest, right? And the idea that this almost like we're only seeing or perceiving kind of a fraction of the story, right? Every piece of this formulation, right, is clipped in some way. Shoshana.
That's why we're just gonna go into the 50 grand and just work that way and then just cash flow what we need to. We're gonna redo the foundation right away.
Right.
Because they have a payment plan, so it's like no interest.
I think it's the same thing. And there's the idea that what Zechariah is prophesying that as opposed to a unity of God that in certain ways theoretical and conceptual, right? It will be obvious and perceptible, right? And there's the idea that like everything is connected to that. Anybody else? I think that we'll leave it at that, and we will move on to the beginning of Parshat Yisro. Okay.
Very good.
We have talked about before the idea, right, that certainly Rashi and Ibn Ezra quote a number of times in different places in Chumash, right, of Ein Mukdam U'Char. The idea that there is no presumption of chronological order, right, of earlier and later in the Torah, right? Whereas the Ramban, right, very much in general is of the approach that our default is that everything is chronological. Right? So sometimes, again, that's the debate of Ein Mukdam U'Char, right? Sometimes that's a question of, let's call it details within a story. In other words, do we assume that when we're reading, and if you remember, that when it came up when we were going through the story, right? There were a number of places where we weren't 100%.
I just want to make sure my family.
Of whether specific psukim really took place where they are chronologically. Again, we're not talking about questions of months or years or whatever. It's within a defined event, right? You know, what is the sequence or the order of what is presented? Everybody with me? Right? But it applies kind of at a much larger level. And again, it's a question of how much latitude we have. In other words, if we assume that the Torah does not have to be chronological, right? What can we, for lack of better words, what can we play? Do something. Can we posit? Let's move this somewhere else, right? So I think certainly the way that I tend to think about these things, the question is more or less, you know, how good a case can you make for it? In other words, like, does this resolve issues and problems in the psukim, right? Or does it create more problems to move it, right? So there's a very big question of when the story of Yisro, right, takes place, right? And it's really a question on, if we drill down, it's not just a question of a binary, like, is it now, is it later, right? It's also that there are, one second. There are perhaps two parts of the story, right? And so if it's two parts of the story, you can also parse it, right? You can say one part. So what I want to run through with you is to just take a look. And the second question that we have is, what if it's out of order, right? There's got to be some order that it's following, right? In other words, that it's generally, right? If we had like some kind of a list of any kind of story, right? In other words, if we are presenting episodes non-chronologically, why would we do that?
Whatever lesson you're trying to bring out from the story, maybe you write out better.
Okay, so in other words, the idea that there may be I call it a conceptual piece of the story, right, that is brought out better. Right, that would work very well with the Mun thing that we mentioned before, right, and perhaps with the Amalek story. In other words, it's for an interest of kind of wholeness, right, of the presentation, right, it makes more sense to sometimes take details that may not have happened yet and put them here so that we have, you want to get a holistic picture of the Mun, right? That's the appendix to the Mun story, right? Certainly that's one reason. Okay, so sometimes you could have something perhaps that's either a flashback or a flash forward, right? But why would you have that? Why would you present it that way?
To just tie the whole thing. I mean, tie the story together.
Okay, so again, sometimes it might have to do with that. And now again, what's interesting is that so both of those are to some degree explaining when you have something that is not sequential within a whole. In other words, if you have let's put it this way. Let's say for a second, the entire story, right, of Yisro, right, takes place later, right? So that in certain ways doesn't address it as why you would do that directly. What you're saying is if I have a story and I include within the context of the story, right, some later details or earlier details, it's there to fill out the story. Right? In certain ways, that the story of Yisro is more or less a unit, right? It's really reads like one single story, right? So the question that we really would have to think about is, what's the function of moving this story? Right? And this is not a detail within a story, right? This is a unit on its own. So why would we displace it in such a way? Right? We have to kind of keep those things up. So what I'm going to do today is a little bit different than, and we're going to really have to come back to, really start digging in. I want to, do this a little bit differently. I want to show you kind of the points, right, where there are arguments to be made, right, pro and con this being here or somewhere else, right? And I want to focus just on that issue of, so what I want to do, we'll start at the beginning part of the class. I will read, and I'll just kind of point some things out to you. Again, if you have any questions on them, we can hear. Fine. Yisro, the priest of Midian, the father-in-law of Moshe, hears as Kashas Hashem Elokim Moshe Yisrael Amo, Ki Yotzi Hashem Es Yisrael Mi Mitzrayim. Right? The Yisro hears everything that happened to the Jewish people, right? That Hashem took the Jews out from Mitzrayim. Now, let me take a step back for a second. There is a little bit of a question of, if we have to place the story, right, that we have something close to the way that we normally learn this, there's close to a half a year hiatus where it seems like this can't be taking place, right? So again, let's go back to the timeline. Jews leave Egypt on the 15th of Nisan, on Pesach, come to the Yam Suf a week later. They spend another 6 weeks, right, until the time of the giving of the Torah, right? So again, the frontal chronological perspective on Parshas Yisro is this is going to happen probably, right, in the week of Matan Torah, the week before, right, Matan Torah, right? Sometimes the last few days of Iyar, right, the first couple of days perhaps of Sivan, right? And that's the only place that chronologically, right, it's a relatively narrow window. Everybody with me so far? Fine. Then we have the episode of the giving of the Torah. Moshe goes to Har Sinai, right? And Moshe goes to Har Sinai for a sequence of basically 3 40-day periods, right? With brief interruptions, the whole story of the golden calf takes place, and so on and so forth. Yeah? Okay. And that culminates, right, half a year later, roughly, on Yom Kippur, and then Moshe is back in the camp, right? And then we start the construction of the Mishkan, right? So the story can't really take place, right, anytime roughly from Shavuos to Yom Kippur, right? So either it happens right before Shavuos, right, a week or two before Shavuos, or it happens at some point after Yom Kippur. Everybody with me so far? Fine. So what is Yisro here that brings him? One more time?
Everything Hashem did.
Okay, and then more specifically?
Hashem brought the Jews out of Egypt.
Right. So it sounds, right, like that the Shmuah, right, and the hearing that Yisro does, right, is of Yitzias Mitzrayim. Now, what that tells us for sure is this happens after Yitzias Mitzrayim. I don't know if we needed to know that, right? It does not say he heard about what happened on Har Sinai, right? It doesn't not say it, but it doesn't say that, right? So again, it's but the impression one gets, right, is that it is Yitzias Mitzrayim itself that is the dramatic event, right, that brings Yisro out, right? Which may be an argument, maybe not it's certainly not a proof, right? But maybe an argument, right, for what we'll call the pre-Sinai reading of this story, okay? Fine. They got Yisro's Chosei Moshe Tzipora, right? Yisro takes Moshe Tzipora, the wife of Moshe, after he sent her away. Again, this is an event that never happened in the Psukim, right? That in the Psukim, all we know is that Moshe was headed to Egypt with Tzipora and his children, and that's the end of the story. That's the last we heard of them in Chumash, right? Apparently, he sent them back. We don't know exactly when, or again, there are midrashim that make some suggestions. Fine. And she comes with the two sons, right, who are named Gershon and Eliezer, and explains the etymology of those names, why that's important now. Again, we'll come back to it. Fine. So this is important, right? That he comes and he finds Moshe, right, in the wilderness that he is dwelling in, right? And that 100% clear who is dwelling there, right? But it tells us that the rendezvous happens in the environs of Har Elokim. Right? Har Elokim is Har Sinai, right? So that again, that also, it can't be later, right? Once the Jews leave Har Sinai, right? The Jews leave Har Sinai on the 20th of Iyar the next year, right? So it has to take place sometime within that year, right? Maybe before, maybe after. If it's going to be before, right, it seems like it has to be once they are at Har Sinai. Now, remember that the way that we read the Psukim, right, even Ezra and others, right, is that Refidim, right, is not far from Har Sinai, right? It's certainly within It seems very close. That may be where the rock was, where the water came from. So it gives us a little bit of wiggle room on that. But they have to be close to Har Sinai. That's when the Psukim tell it. Moshe is told that Yisro is coming. Moshe goes out to greet him, and he kisses him, and they bow. It's beautiful, and he brings him ha'ohela, right? He brings him into the tent. Right now, we don't know exactly what this. It seems to be a definite article, right? That it's some kind of important tent, right? But we don't know what tent it is, right? Maybe we'll come back to it. Fine. Right? Moshe tells over everything that Hashem did to Paro, to Mitzrayim, regarding the Jewish people, right? All of the travails in the desert and how God saved them. Again, here, once again, nothing about Har Sinai, right? It sounds like the description matches very, very neatly with Parashat Beshalach. Fine. And Yisro was happy about the fact that Hashem saved them from the hand of Mitzrayim. Again, it's interesting. It's a little bit hard for us, right? Because we live in the world of the instantaneous news cycle. I wound up actually yesterday at some point. I wound up looking at all of my social media posting since the beginning of the war, which is we're now 6 months basically from the beginning of the war. And it was interesting, right? And it was in certain ways for us, it's a long time, right? 6 months is a significant period of time, particularly the fact that we are still so embroiled in this. But it was interesting to just kind of look for, at least for me, to just to look at the timeline, right? And it was what were the different things that happened, marking off the period of the war, right? The sense that one gets, right? So we're used to instantaneous knowledge of things that are happening. Right? I don't remember who I told this somebody a few years ago. I did a whole deep dive on the Yom Kippur War as experienced in Pittsburgh, and I went through the Jewish Chronicles from that time, and they announced that if you wanted a daily radio hookup of news from Israel, you could go down to the Federation Building at noon every day to listen to this live update from Israel, right? Which is it's so remarkable, right? And there's the idea that our expectations now are so immediate, right? And it's interesting because even in halacha, right, we have, when it comes to avelos, right, we have a concept called a shmua krova and a shmua rechoka, right? And there's when do you find out about the death? And there are halacha ramifications. If you find out within 30 days, right, of a relative dying, then you start the whole process of avelos at that point, right? And you do basically a regular avelos, but in other words, the trigger is when did I hear? But after 30 days, right, and if you find out 6 months later, right, that your relative died, right, then you do an immediate, very brief, I think it's a day of Shiva at that point, and that's it, right? And there's the idea that once it's old news, right, it loses a certain power. And that's not even just in our. Why do I mention this? Because the sense one gets, right, certainly one possibility, right, is that Yetzias Mitzrayim is very fresh, and that this is something